It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be faultless, but it has to do the thing that it's set out to do. I think that's an engineer's mindset. Everything else is padding or future-proofing, but it needs to do the thing.
Welcome to the Spotlight interview, and it's a real pleasure to have Mike Lehan with us this morning as we're talking about his work. Mike is Chief Technical Officer with StuRents.com, and we're just going to have a little chat about his work and encouragements, as well as some of the lessons he's learned over the years in his field. So, Mike, it's again a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your business story. How and why did you get into the world of tech startups?
I sort of ended up there by accident, if I'm honest. I'd learned programming in various guises through school and sixth form. I ended up doing a bit of website work at my college in Durham when I went to university there, and then I ran out of money, and so I realized that a good way to get money was to make websites for people, and so I sort of used what I've been doing on the side, started making websites. When I graduated, I just kind of kept going. I graduated right at the end of the financial crisis, so job hunting was a particular awkward thing at that time.
So that was around 2008, was it, Mike?
2010. So sort of the recovery had started, but in terms of engineering jobs, it wasn't a particularly rosy market, at least in the UK. And so I decided to try and make some money on my own, on and off for a while. But eventually, I sort of found my niche, started building software for people, and just kind of, as I kept going ever since.
And it's fascinating that getting into the tech stuff, your first business was in parachute skydiving, wasn't it? And that sort of thing. And then you've moved into StuRents. What were some of the highlights from that work with the skydiving operation that you had and the tech that you were developing there?
Well, so I started doing that, again, slightly accidentally. I wanted to build advertising websites, commerce websites, selling skydives online for people. But it just turned out there wasn't a huge amount of interest for that, because people already had websites built with things like WordPress, and they were kind of happy. They weren't great, but they were happy with them. So I pitched this idea of, well, how about I build a website that actually manages your entire operation, like manages your aircraft, manages your instructors, coordinates, your insurance, things like that. And most people just ignored me. One centre said, "Hey, that sounds amazing. Come down and take a look at it." And so I started building it, and then other centres heard about it, and eventually I ended up being flown over to California, working at some centres over there. And the furthest flung place my software has been used is a small island in Panama that holds a skydiving event once a year. Cancelled this year, sadly, because of COVID. But I think the things I learned there were just getting to really know customers, and not in that kind of slightly greasy sort of, oh, be nice to them and they'll buy things off you kind of way, but genuinely understanding them. And I would often go to an airfield. I would sit all day with the staff who worked on the software, and then overnight I'd make all the adjustments that I thought they needed. So I'd then go to bed at sort of 4 or 5 in the morning and get up again at 8 or 9 and sit with the staff again, but they'd have a new system in the morning than they had the previous day. So You'd get this very rapid iteration. And a lot of that's the kind of stuff that comes out of Silicon Valley, but that comes out of Silicon Valley with sort of 10, 20 plus person dev teams. I was just doing this kind of on my own. And in a way, I was reinventing methodology that already existed. I just hadn't heard about it because of the way that I got into this sort of quite accidentally. And then I come into the sort of more open tech world. I speak at some conferences now, and you realize, all these things that I kind of worked out to do have just been they've been best practice for about the same time. So other people were working out how to do that over in the Valley and over in other places at the same time.
So obviously you moved from that highly adaptable and a high level of resilience when you're doing everything by yourself into a team with StuRents. And if I remember correctly, your co-founders, co-directors are friends from university as well. Tell us a little bit about some of the encouragement from StuRents and a little bit, thumbnail sketch of what the business is about.
Yeah, so StuRents is a student property marketplace. That was set up. That was actually one of my freelance gigs back at university. So the people I started the business, who started that business, were sort of just contacts rather than necessarily people I spent much time with. They heard that there was this guy doing websites, and they bought me lunch, and I was up for that. And so I built this site for them, and again, we just built something that people that appealed to people. It kind of just got traction naturally. So again, we didn't need to spend this huge amount of venture capital investment kind of thing on building something. We just sort of built a little thing, and people liked it and started using it in Durham, and then in Newcastle and York, and then kind of spread from there. And I think that again, there's an encouragement there in the model of the unicorns, this sort of Silicon Valley $1 billion companies that sort of are meant to burn enormous amounts of money and sort of rinse everyone to the bone in terms of their workload, isn't the only way to build a business. You can build a business that sort of starts light and starts with just providing something people want, and then iterating from there. We have gone on and we have raised money, but we haven't done it in the way that kind of a desperate need for huge valuations. We've kind of gone, we need this bit of cash to do this thing, and then we've raised some money, and then we've done that thing, and then we go back and say, hey, we did the thing. Can we have a bit more cash for the next thing? And people are trusting us because of that. And so I think there's an encouragement in the fact that you can do business not in this kind of social network Silicon Valley way.
Yeah. And the vision within StuRents as well. Obviously, you're dealing with student accommodation. You're not just providing a platform. You do want to shape the culture of how student accommodation is formed. What changes, what encouragements have you seen on that level?
I think one of the big things is that there's an increasing level of care for the student well-being amongst accommodation providers. When we started out, the larger providers tended just to be large letting agents who might have already had existing residential or sale or commercial portfolios, and they were just letting some of that stock out to students. So that the students weren't being cared for. But what you have to remember with student property is that students are doing most of it for the first time. They've not lived in 5 different flats. They don't know what a guarantor is, or what a reference is, or what a deposit is. They don't necessarily know how to set up their bills. And you can treat that in 2 ways. You can treat it as a marketing opportunity and be quite predatory in trying to offer them things they don't need, or upsell the services to a very high level. Or you can kind of help them out. And I think we're seeing a lot more businesses that are helping students out. You've got these big student halls, which they divide people on the level of like, oh, planning permission, should they be building these big tower blocks? But actually, there's a big benefit. It stops taking houses away from like families in residential areas and puts students where they kind of want to be, which is in a big group. And it puts facilities at a doorstep. So, it puts welfare facilities and care, people to watch out for them, people to make sure they, if there's some concern for their well-being, that someone's out for them, that's not just in the hands of the university. And, it's a weird area where private enterprise is making money, but it's also making money by providing a helpful service.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And obviously in the current situation with COVID-19, the lockdown that we're still in, and obviously it's easing up at the moment, but for the last couple of months, students moving away from university, leaving student accommodation. From your perspective as a business, what have been some of the challenges you've had to, 1 or 2 of them that you've had to navigate and feel you've navigated well at this time?
So I think our larger challenge has been more the move into a remote workforce. We already had 2 offices. So one office where I'm based here in Manchester, and our main office in London. And so the Manchester office is just tech, which is just a development office. And then in London, we have a mixture of kind of the business team and a few developers as well. So there's always been, a need to communicate well between those 2 offices. So, we're no strangers to video calls, and we, use Slack for a lot of communication. Indeed, there are times that I'm in the London office and people don't realize I'm there, because I arrive in the office, I sit on my laptop and I start communicating on Slack, because that's what I'm used to. And only at some point do they stand up and realize I'm actually been sat in the room with them. And, part of that's because as a developer, I'm naturally inclined to do things through a computer if I can do so. But also there's a value in clear communication that comes from typing things down and being able to look back on them, especially when it comes to programming. So those things were already part of our culture, and that's really helped us through this, because now we're remote, but we're working in very similar ways. I think the harder part has been that we just enjoyed each other's company. The office was a social place, and that's great to have built that. Like you read a lot of books and a lot of, you can watch so many talks and hear podcasts about building company culture. When you actually have to do it, it's not nearly as sort of step by step as it makes it look. But actually, I think what we've seen from the fact that people are a bit lonely and are a bit missing the office is that actually we've made an office culture people want to be part of. And for all that I'm not a huge fan of the city of London, I miss my travels down to London to see people, to see the team, and to actually work with them. I say I'm a big proponent of flexible working, people being open to remote and working all over the world if they want to. But I think you also need face-to-face time, because that's where the personal side of the business comes in. Otherwise, we are just kind of interchangeable robots that program for a living, and that's not a particularly like heartening place to be.
Thinking of your active Christian faith and how that connects with your work, your faith is an integral part of who you are. How have you seen it impact and be a resource in your everyday work?
So the role, especially of building a startup, is generally very high and low. You do go very quickly from this was great, this really worked, this was fantastic, or you sign a new customer, and when you're a big company, if you imagine being I don't know, Spotify or someone, a new customer creating a premium account for £10 a month is not something to shout about. Whereas when you are a small company, every customer is really critical. So you get excited with new customers. And then there are times when things just go wrong, especially technically. Code goes wrong, backups go wrong, your servers go down, there are general internet problems. Sometimes problems aren't your own, but you have to own them because maybe they're a problem with your downstream payment provider. And ultimately, people don't know that. You can't explain, oh, by the way, the credit card system's having some problems. You have to say, sorry, our system doesn't work at the moment. And you have angry customers who are saying, oh, my tenants can't pay their rent. So I think there's a big mix of that, and therefore it's high pressure. And so for me, where my faith comes in is kind of God giving me some perspective, giving me a chance to look outside of what I'm doing, as in this bug, this software bug you're working on right now, is it really the most critical thing in the world? Is it really the thing that defines you? Is your success or failure in handling this actually going to define who you are from now on? And I think in the world of work, especially in the world of tech startups, often the answer is yes. If you don't fix that bug, you are a failure. If you don't build that great platform, you are behind the times. You're outdated. Someone who I was doing some work for who vastly underestimated the complexity of the project they're asking me to do once insulted me by calling me a hobbyist. And I thought that was a really interesting insult, because it was very pointed at the things that matter to software developers. We want to be professional and good at this. And software development is a really young field. So everyone's new in a way. And so I think having an identity in something else, and in my case, that identity being in Jesus, is super important, because it basically says, well, this is where you're grounded, this is what you are. Now you go out and do this thing. And if this thing goes well, wonderful. And if this thing goes badly, we'll come back and we'll work out what to do next. It's not a matter of, hey, you're now a failure, and to me, that takes a lot of pressure off. It should take more pressure off than it does. Sometimes I still get in the wrong mindset, but I try and focus on the idea that actually, if that's what my identity is, I can go there and I can rest, and then I can come back and refresh and keep doing what I'm doing.
And I suppose as well, that security and identity in Jesus Christ gives you a strength to be able to serve even when you're in the tough situations and maybe clients aren't seeing eye to eye with you. There's that conflict, that you can have a strength and a resource that comes from a relationship with God, which fuels you to serve and do better in that context as well. When you're thinking about work, and obviously in the field, you said you've been a platform speaker as well at conferences and stuff like this. Obviously, there's loads of advice and lessons out there and things you've learned along the way and things people have told you and you've applied. What's been a key lesson that you've learned, or a best bit of advice you've been given and applied in your work?
I think it's probably to question the things that you're being told. It's above all. I went to an excellent keynote speech at the Dutch PHP conference last year, where a brilliant speaker basically stood up and said that everything that is mostly preached around modern software design methodology and how we plan software is wrong and misguided. And not only did he say that, but he demonstrated it by using physics and unit calculation to prove that a lot of the measurements we use are wrong. And you sit there, and obviously part of you thinking this guy's incredible, but you also go, well, hang on, this thing that I work on, how is this wrong? And I think what you have to realize is that you can't take anything as dogma. Ultimately, what's in front of you and the thing you're working on is the most important part of what you're doing. And you get so many of these outside influences, and that's the problem with over listening to podcasts and almost going to too many talks and too many conferences. I do remember there was a time in Manchester, sort of in the early 2010s, when there were so many tech events. It was great. It felt like the city was buzzing, but you kind of realized it was a sort of snake eating its own tail. It was just going round and round, everyone talking and talking and talking, and no one actually doing. And Manchester's gone a lot quieter since then. But I'm hoping that's because more people are just doing and knuckling down and getting work done, rather than talking about it endlessly to try and make themselves sort of seem maybe bigger than they are. Because I guess at one time being bigger than you are attracted investment, but that opportunity's gone now for a lot of people. So yeah, I think just getting on and doing the work you're doing is probably the biggest lesson. It's certainly what I've tried to do. And again, I'm not sort of driving my Tesla around the Kennedy Space Center, but at the same time, we have a business, we employ staff, and we've made a sustainable business for sort of 5+ years now. So I think something's going right in that.
Brilliant. And you mentioned there just Manchester and the aspirations it has to continue to develop tech and be a tech hub. If there's one thing that could be done better in Manchester, or that Manchester should take hold of, what do you think it would be in terms of developing as a tech hub? Is it diversity? Is it skills opportunity? Is it a better flow from the creativity and the sort of startup mentality of people at college or school or university going into the workplace?
I think definitely as someone who hires software engineers, it's been very challenging to hire engineers of a sort of sufficient caliber to work on something that's like a complicated web application. I think Manchester has a wide pool of web developers who are well trained and they're good at what they do. And what they do is make e-commerce websites and advertising websites, agency websites, and that's fantastic. And there needs to be that industry. There is that industry. Manchester's got a thriving digital sector. I think what we need is training in software engineers to kind of make that leap from web developer to engineer, to kind of start solving more complicated problems. And I don't know where that push has to come from exactly. One of them is obviously there need to be businesses to employ them, but there are businesses to employ them, and everyone I know who is kind of running a similar business is struggling to hire people. And I think the other side therefore must be some sort of financial incentive, and that probably comes from investment. I.e., actually the startup, what we're saying is to someone, you probably have to take a lower salary with us than you would with maybe an agency who just goes out and gets loads of really great creative contracts. Well, that doesn't look appealing to someone to try and do you want to come do a more stressful job for less money is not the easiest sales pitch. So if you brought investment in, you can increase their salaries, and that motivates people. But there is also a massive diversity gap. It would be wrong not to mention that. And that's the biggest swing is gender diversity, but ethnic diversity as well, and diversity of background is another one. That's I've seen some positive moves myself in that sector, in background diversity, but in terms of gender diversity and ethnic diversity, there's not a huge move on it in Manchester. And I think that the universities, the universities have a better diversity range, and funneling those people into local jobs rather than people moving back away from Manchester after university would be really key thing for the universities.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you. And just final two questions. What does a job well done look like for you?
At the end of the day, I want something that is complete. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be faultless, but it has to do the thing that it set out to do. I think that's an engineer's mindset. If it does the thing, then it's done. Everything else is padding or future proofing or anything else, but it needs to do the thing.
That's great. Lovely and clear. Typical engineer, straight to the point with it. Thanks, Mike. And if you were obviously in lockdown, probably having time with the family and enjoying, maybe picking up new books and stuff like this, catching up on a few things, hopefully, that have been restful. If we were to move lockdown to a desert island and it was just you, what's the one luxury you'd have to have with you?
A satellite phone.
Yeah, again, gets the job done, doesn't it?
Helpful. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how far out those work, but I imagine them pretty effective, and definitely better than 5G.
Excellent stuff. Well, Mike, thanks so much for taking the time today to have a chat with us for this spotlight interview for Ministry of Business. And we hope that work continues to go well at Stu Rents. And again, thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom and insights.
Thanks a lot, Pete. It's been great to talk to you.